One moment, the desert was a flat, monotonous sea of sun-bleached sand, and the next, the world erupted. The jolt was not the familiar grinding crunch of the tank's treads over rock, but something far more profound. It was a deep, resonant thud that traveled through 68 tons of American steel and into the very bones of the four men inside. The M101 Abrams, a fortress on tracks, shuddered violently as its forward momentum was arrested by something impossibly solid buried beneath the golden grains. Sand sprayed over the glacis plate in a dry wave, and the metallic groan of stressed armor filled the compartment, a sound of protest that was immediately drowned out by the shriek of internal alarms. Before anyone could form a coherent thought, the ground itself seemed to come alive. The sand beneath them shifted, not like a dune settling, but with a deliberate, muscular heave. The tank listed sharply to port, throwing the crew against their harnesses. Loose equipment, a canteen, a laminated map, a deck of well-worn cards, flew from its stowage, becoming projectiles in the sudden chaos. The air, already thick with the smells of diesel, oil, and sweat, was now charged with a sharp electric scent of panic. Shouts overlapped, fragmented and desperate, lost in the cacophony. The loader was thrown against the breech of the main gun with a sickening thud. The gunner's helmeted head cracked against his sighting mechanism. From the commander's cupola above, Captain Miller's voice cut through the noise, a strained bark of command that was more instinct than order. The driver, white-knuckled at his controls, fought the unresponsive steering yokes as the entire vehicle began to move against its will, not forward but sideways, dragged by some immense subterranean force. Through the vision blocks, the world outside was a swirling maelstrom of ochre dust. The familiar horizon line was gone, replaced by a tilting, lurching nightmare. The tank groaned again, a deep bass note of agony as the unseen thing beneath the sand adjusted its grip, its movement creating a small, fast-growing sinkhole that threatened to swallow them whole. This was no buried wreckage, no forgotten piece of infrastructure. This was something that had felt their weight and had decided to push back. The mystery of what they had struck was no longer an academic question. It was a living, breathing entity that had them in its grasp, and the only thing louder than the screaming metal and blaring alarms was the deafening roar of pure, undiluted fear in every man's chest. The sun over the Anbar province was not merely a star, it was an aggressor. It hammered the landscape into a flat, shimmering expanse of bleached gold and baked clay, a place where the very air seemed to crackle with hostile heat. This was the world of 2003, a world defined by the sprawling, sun-scorched desolation near Fallujah. For the men of the armored cavalry, the desert was not an empty space but a canvas of potential threats, every dune a possible hiding place, every wadi a potential ambush site. Their existence was a paradox of immense power and profound vulnerability, encapsulated within the steel hulls of their Abrams tanks. Their purpose here was reconnaissance, a mission that sounded straightforward on an operations map, but was endlessly complex on the ground. The task was to be the Army's eyes, surveying the vast, empty stretches for signs of insurgent movement. The telltale glint of a scope, the fresh tracks of a technical vehicle, the fleeting shadows of men who knew this land intimately and moved through it like ghosts. From the forward operating base, a hastily assembled collection of sandbagged bunkers and dust-colored tents, their patrols would roll out into the immense silence, a silence that was itself a form of psychological warfare. The base operated with a grim, sun-faded efficiency. The pre-dawn hours were a frenzy of activity, all conducted under the watchful eye of a guard. Tower's machine gun. Mechanics, their uniforms stained dark with sweat and grease, performed the sacred rituals of maintenance on the tanks, their chants the whir of impact wrenches and the hiss of air compressors. The air tasted of fine dust, diesel exhaust, and the acrid tang of fear that no amount of bravado could fully mask. Every outgoing patrol was a ritual of preparation, checking comms, loading belts of coaxial machine gun ammunition, scanning the latest intel reports that were often little more than educated guesses. Then came the transition from the relative safety of the wire to the open desert, a transition that always tightened the chest and sharpened the senses. The landscape was monotonous only to the uninitiated. To the soldiers, every subtle variation was a data point. A rock out of place, a patch of sand that seemed too disturbed, the unnatural stillness of a birdless sky. All of it was logged, analyzed, and weighed against the ever-present tension of operating in hostile territory. The frequent sandstorms were a special kind of torment, reducing the world to a swirling particulate hell where visibility dropped to zero, and the only reality was the interior of the tank and the constant, static-laced chatter over the radio. It was a place where the line between vigilance and paranoia, was as thin as a razor's edge, and every soldier walked it, day after scorching day, knowing that the emptiness around them was a lie, and that the real enemy was not the heat or the sand, but the patient, invisible threat waiting for a single moment of lapsed attention. In the crucible of the desert, a crew was forged not just from steel and training, but from the starkly different personalities crammed into the tank's hot, oily interior. At the helm was Captain Miller, a man whose spine seemed to be made of the same reinforced alloy as his vehicle. His command was a study in rigid protocol, his voice a calm metronomic presence over the intercom that brooked no deviation from procedure. Every order was precise, every action measured against the vast ledger of military doctrine he carried in his mind. He was the unyielding anchor, a man who believed that the correct application of rules was the only bulwark against the chaos of war. Across from him, a stark contrast in both demeanor and experience, sat Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez, known to everyone as Gunny. His face was a roadmap of past conflicts, etched with lines that spoke of decades spent in the company of violence. Where Miller saw checklists and regulations, Gunny saw angles of attack and fields of fire, his instincts honed by a lifetime in the Corps. His hands, resting on the .50 caliber's grips, were permanently dusted with a fine grit of gunpowder and sand, and his quiet, observant presence in the cupola was a constant, unspoken reassurance. He was the crew's institutional memory, a living archive of what worked and what got men killed. Then there was Dr. Alistair Evans, a civilian anomaly in their midst, his pressed khakis and scientific curiosity seeming absurdly out of place. A geologist contracted to study seismic and geological anomalies in the region, he viewed the desert not as a battlefield, but as a laboratory. While the soldiers scanned for insurgents, his eyes were fixed on the strata of rock cuttings or the readings of his portable ground-penetrating radar, his mind buzzing with theories about subterranean aquifers and shifting plates. His presence was a source of quiet friction, his civilian status and academic detachment a world away from the crew's immediate, lethal concerns. Medic Jenkins was their quiet guardian, a man whose entire being was oriented toward the anticipation of trauma. His medical kit was a shrine of order amidst the controlled chaos, every bandage, every vial of morphine, every tourniquet placed with reverent precision. He moved with a calm, economical grace, his eyes constantly performing a triage of his crewmates, diagnosing not just physical ailments, but the subtle cracks of fatigue and fear. He was the promise of a chance, however slim, should the unthinkable happen. Sergeant Cox, the gunner, provided the crew's cynical counterbalance. A man of absolute, unshakable pragmatism, he dismissed anything that couldn't be explained by ballistics, bad luck, or enemy action. Unexplained sensor pings were glitches, strange sounds were the wind, and any talk of the unknown was, in his book, a dangerous step towards superstition and panic. His skepticism was a wall, built to keep out the creeping dread that the desert so readily invited. And then there was me, Private First Class Alex, the loader. I was the youngest, the least experienced, a boy trying to fill a man's role in a steel box of giants. My world was a cycle of heaving heavy, greasy shells into the breach and trying to control the tremor in my hands. I watched Miller's discipline, envied Gunny's effortless competence, was baffled by Dr. Evans's intellectual detachment, trusted Jenkins with a childlike faith, and feared the day Cox's skepticism would be proven wrong. My duty was simple, my terror complex. I was the raw nerve of the crew, feeling every jolt, every unexplained noise, every shared glance of unease with an intensity that the veterans had long since learned to bury. Together, we were a fragile ecosystem of discipline, experience, science, compassion, doubt, and fear, all trapped in a rolling fortress, waiting for the desert to test what held us together. The war was not always a screaming impact or the heart-pounding tension of a patrol. More often, it was a grinding, sun-bleached monotony, a cycle of rituals performed under a merciless sky. Their lives were governed by the clock and the checklist, a predictable rhythm that offered its own strange comfort in a land of unseen threats. Each day began before the sun, with a jarring wake-up call that ripped them from fleeting, air-conditioned dreams. They would stumble into the still, cool darkness, their bodies moving on autopilot through the first and most sacred ritual of the day, the morning drill. In the pre-dawn gloom, the tank park was a symphony of controlled chaos, the clang of hatches, the sputter of diesel engines coughing to life, and the crisp, clipped reports of crew chiefs formed a familiar soundtrack. Captain Miller moved among the vehicles, his presence a silent demand for perfection. Every strap was checked, every fluid level verified, every weapon system cleared and function tested. For an hour, there was no room for individual thought, only the collective execution of procedure. It was a kind of meditation, the repetition of familiar tasks sanding down the sharp edges of anxiety. After the drills came the maintenance, a battle against the desert itself. The fine talcum powder sand was an insidious enemy, infiltrating every seal, clogging every filter, grinding away at moving parts with infinite patience. Shirtless and sweating under the climbing sun, they would spend hours scraping, cleaning, and lubricating. Gunny Rodriguez oversaw this work with a quiet authority, his experienced eyes spotting a loose bolt or a worn trackpad long before it became a failure. He taught not just how to maintain the machine, but why. How a clean air filter meant power, how a well-tensioned track meant survival. It was physical, mind-numbing work, but it was honest. The tank, in return for their labor, promised a sliver of security. The afternoons were the true test of morale. Long stretches of dead time between patrols where the heat and boredom became a palpable force. The base seemed to shrink, the dust and the fences closing in. It was in these hollow hours that the crew's bonds were forged in the fires of shared idleness. They would huddle in the shade of the tank's massive hull, or in their sweltering tent, a deck of grimy playing cards their only defense against the stillness. The game was always the same, but the stories that unfolded around it were not. Gunny would slowly clean his sidearm, sharing fragments of deployments past. A bar in Manila, a frozen ridge in Korea, the smell of cordite in a dusty Afghan village. His stories were never boastful, just matter-of-fact recollections that painted a picture of a life spent in service. Sergeant Cox would counter, with his own brand of dark humor, cracking jokes about incompetent lieutenants in the mythical perfect chow hall, his skepticism a shield against sentimentality. Dr. Evans would listen, with academic fascination, occasionally interjecting with a geological fact about the desert floor beneath them, a reminder of a world operating on a timescale far beyond their own. Medic Jenkins was often silent, mending a torn uniform or organizing his kit, his calm presence a steadying anchor. Private First Class, Alex watched them all, absorbing the cadence of their camaraderie. He saw the way a shared laugh could momentarily erase the fatigue from Miller's eyes, the way Gunny's quiet nod could validate a young soldier's fear. This was the psychological toll of their war, paid not in a single traumatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of lonely hours and the constant, low-grade hum of apprehension. The routine was their bulwark, a carefully constructed fiction of normalcy. They polished their gear, played their hands of cards, and told their stories, all the while trying to ignore the vast, silent desert that stretched beyond the wire, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like a held breath, a stark contrast to the coming strangeness that would soon shatter their fragile, precious routine forever. It began not with a roar, but with a whisper in the machine. The desert stretched out, a vast, shimmering plain of stillness under the oppressive midday sun. Inside the tank, the world was reduced to the hum of electronics and the stale, recycled air. I was halfway through a methodical check of the ready rack ammunition, the heavy, cool shells of familiar comfort in my hands, when the sensor display at the gunner's station emitted a soft, persistent chime. It was a sound out of place, a digital bird call in a steel cave. Sergeant Cox's voice was a dry rasp over the intercom, laced with his trademark dismissal. He reported a large unidentifiable return on the ground-penetrating radar. The screen showed a blur of amorphous color, a ghost in the machine deep beneath the sand, but it was moving, not with the slow geological drift of a shifting dune, but with purpose, tracking a parallel course to our own patrol route several meters below the surface. The thing was massive, its signal blotting out the clean, stratified layers of sediment, a living ink blot in the Earth's belly. Captain Miller's response was immediate and clipped, a perfect reflection of his doctrine. He ordered the contact reported up the chain, the words transmitted in sterile, military code that stripped the event of its inherent strangeness. The reply from command was swift and dismissive. It was logged as a sensor glitch, a common anomaly caused by thermal layers or a pocket of mineralized water. The official verdict was a natural occurrence, not a threat. The matter was closed. But in the tank it was not closed. Chief Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the situation from his cupola, slowly sank back into his seat. His silence was more unnerving than any outburst. His experienced eyes, which had seen so many forms of death, now held a flicker of something new, a deep primal unease. He didn't cite regulations or precedent. He simply stared at the command screen as if willing it to show him the truth, his knuckles white where they gripped the .50 caliber's butterfly triggers. Captain Miller insisted on following orders, his voice firm, a bulwark against the creeping uncertainty. He reiterated the command's assessment, focusing our attention back to the visible horizon, to the known threats of insurgents and IEDs. Yet, anew. Tension had entered the compartment, a silent friction between Miller's disciplined world of clear-cut orders and Gunny's instinctual world of unspoken dangers. A cold dread began to uncoil in my own gut, a sensation entirely different from the sharp spike of fear during an ambush. This was slower, colder, seeping into the cracks of my composure. It was the fear of the unknown, of something that defied the neat categories of our training. We were prepared for men with rifles, for hidden explosives, for the treachery of our own kind. We were not prepared for the Earth itself to harbor a secret life. Dr. Evans, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, said nothing to the crew. Instead, he unclipped a small leather-bound notebook from his vest. While the soldiers argued in glances and tense silence, his pen began to move, scratching hurriedly across the page. He wasn't jotting down the official explanation. He was sketching the erratic movement pattern of the subsurface return, his brow furrowed in concentration. He made notes in the margins, theorizing about mass, density, and locomotion, his scientific curiosity piqued by the very thing command had dismissed. In his meticulous script, he was documenting the first breadcrumb on a trail that led away from the comfortable certainties of war and into a deeper, darker mystery lying in wait just beneath our treads. The desert began to speak in a new, unsettling language. It was no longer just a passive expanse of heat and silence. It was now an active participant, leaving cryptic messages in the sand and on the airwaves. The first of these messages was discovered at dawn, after a night punctuated by the distant, lonely cry of a jackal. The perimeter guard reported strange markings just beyond the wire, and a small team, including our tank crew, was dispatched to investigate. There, etched into the hard-packed sand as if by some impossibly large and precise tool, was a series of tracks. They were not the familiar pawed prints of desert fauna, nor the tread marks of a vehicle. These were deep, sinuous grooves, arranged in a bizarre, overlapping spiral pattern that stretched for over 50 meters before vanishing into the side of a dune. The pattern was too deliberate, too complex to be natural erosion. It looked like a glyph, a sentence written in a forgotten tongue. Dr. Evans was on his knees immediately, his civilian boots sinking into the fine sand as he used a ruler and a small camera to document every curve and depth. He muttered to himself, theories tumbling out in a low, excited stream. He spoke of peristaltic motion, of immense pressure exerted from below, of a creature that might move through the earth like a ship through water, its passage leaving these strange patterned wakes on the surface. His eyes shone with the thrill of discovery, a stark contrast to the grim faces of the soldiers surrounding him. Sergeant Cox stood back, arms crossed, his expression a mask of pure derision. He scoffed loudly, kicking at the edge of one of the grooves, sending a puff of sand into the still morning air. He declared it the work of the wind, a freak weather pattern, or maybe even some local kids playing a prank with a piece of scrap metal. His voice was a blunt instrument, hammering against Evans' delicate hypotheses. He called it paranoia, a dangerous contagion spread by an overactive imagination, and a scientist who didn't know the first thing about the real world. His ridicule was a deliberate tactic, an attempt to reassert the dominance of the known and the logical over the creeping unease that the tracks inspired. The second message came through the air. Later that same day, during a routine check-in with base command, the radios, which were normally a lifeline of crisp, clear communication, suddenly filled with a dense, churning static. It wasn't the usual crackle of solar interference or a weak signal. This was a viscous, swallowing noise, a digital roar that obliterated every word. For nearly a full minute, the channel was dead, consumed by this unnatural silence. Then, as abruptly as it began, it cleared, leaving only the confused, frustrated voices of the radio operator on the other end, demanding a repeat of the last transmission. In the following debriefing, held in the stifling heat of the command tent, the simmering tensions boiled over. Dr. Evans stood before the unit's leadership, his notebook open, pointing to his sketches of the tracks and referencing the radio static as correlated phenomena. He theorized about powerful bioelectromagnetic fields, about a large subterranean organism whose movements could disrupt local geology and electromagnetic waves alike. He was earnest, persuasive in his own academic way. But Sergeant Cox was waiting. He interrupted Evans not with a shout, but with a slow, deliberate laugh. He leaned back in his chair, the legs scraping against the plywood floor, and painted Evans as a frightened academic seeing monsters in the shadows. He turned to Captain Miller, appealing to his military sensibilities. He argued that buying into this nonsense was a distraction, a luxury they couldn't afford when there were real, human enemies to fight. The crew, seated around the table, was no longer a unit. They were a fractured council. Chief Rodriguez watched the exchange with a heavy, knowing silence, his gaze occasionally drifting from Evans to Cox, weighing the scientist's curiosity against the sergeant's denial. Medic Jenkins looked concerned, his eyes scanning the faces of his comrades as if diagnosing the early symptoms of a collective breakdown. And I, Private First Class Alex, felt the division like a physical crack forming in the floor beneath us. The tracks in the sand and the static on the radio were no longer just anomalies, they were the first tremors of a coming quake, and we were already splitting apart along the fault lines. The desert's patience finally broke. It happened not under the cover of darkness, but in the brutal, revealing light of midday. A low dune, one that had anchored the horizon for weeks, simply collapsed. There was no wind to cause it, no tremor to unsettle it. One moment it was a graceful, wind-sculpted curve of golden sand, the next it slumped inward with a deep, sighing roar, as if the ground beneath had been yanked away. A vast cloud of dust plumed into the still air, a pale ghost against the hard blue sky, and when it settled, the sight that was revealed stole the breath from every man who witnessed it. Where the heart of the dune had been, a wound now gaped in the earth. Exposed to the relentless sun was not bedrock or a hidden aquifer, but a structure. It was a latticework of what appeared to be thick, fibrous root-like tendrils, woven together in a complex organic geometry. The material was a dull, mottled gray, like old bone or fossilized wood, and it pulsed with a faint rhythmic vibration that could be felt through the soles of their boots even from a distance. It was neither metal nor stone. It looked grown, not built, a grotesque architecture that belonged to no world they knew. The sheer, unnatural scale of it was humbling. A secret anatomy of the desert laid bare. A young private from a neighboring tank, a kid named Davis with a face still soft with youth, was the one who saw it move. He had been on perimeter watch, his binoculars trained on the collapse, and he started screaming, his voice cracking with a terror so pure it was contagious. He babbled, pointing a shaking finger, claiming that just before the dust had fully cleared, he had seen something enormous and pale shift in the newly formed cavity. He described it not as a shape, but as a movement, a colossal, muscular contraction deep within the tangle of roots, a slow, deliberate recoil from the light, something so vast it made the exposed structure seem like mere surface capillaries. His story, told between ragged sobs to a stone-faced Captain Miller, was dismissed as heat stroke and panic by the command log, but the wild, unhinged look in his eyes was a truth that no official report could erase. Captain Miller's response was a masterpiece of controlled dissonance. His voice over the battalion net was calm, authoritative, ordering an immediate increase in vigilance, a doubling of watch rotations, and a strict 50-meter standoff perimeter from the collapse site. But to his own crew, his tone was different, softer, almost placating. He downplayed the threat, calling it a geological oddity, and stressed the importance of not letting speculation undermine discipline. He was a man trying to hold two contradictory realities in his mind at once, and the strain was beginning to show in the tightness around his mouth and the way his eyes refused to linger too long on the exposed chasm. Medic Jenkins, ever the pragmatist, heard the captain's orders and immediately began his own quiet assessment. While the others stared at the impossible sight, he retreated into the belly of the tank. He unlocked his medical locker and began a silent, methodical inventory of his supplies. He counted rolls of gauze, checked the seals on 4 bags, and laid out his tourniquets, his movements a solemn ritual. He wasn't preparing for shrapnel wounds or gunshots anymore. He was counting the ways to staunch a hemorrhage from a wound he could not yet imagine, his calm efficiency a stark, terrifying counterpoint to the captain's forced optimism. As the day wore on and the shadow of the crater stretched long across the sand, the crew's collective fear began to mutate. It was no longer a simple, sharp-pointed anxiety. It was a slow, disorienting blurring of reality itself. The solid ground was proven treacherous, a thin skin over a hidden, living world. The familiar rules of their existence, the certainty of steel, the logic of combat, the very nature of the earth beneath them, were dissolving. They looked at the exposed, pulsing structure and then at their own hands, at the mundane reality of their tank, and the two images would not align. The line between the possible and the impossible had not just been crossed, it had been erased, leaving them stranded in a new and terrifying landscape where the sand itself had teeth, and the ground had a heartbeat. The desert floor, which had been a placid sea of sun-baked sand, suddenly became a living, malevolent force. It was during a routine patrol along a seemingly endless stretch of dunes that the theoretical became terrifyingly real. The lead tank in the column, call sign Warhammer, was 100 meters ahead of us, its bulky silhouette a familiar landmark against the shimmering heat haze. One moment it was rolling forward with the steady, grinding confidence of an Abrams. The next, the sand directly beneath its left side treads erupted. It was not an explosion of fire and shrapnel, but of pure, raw kinetic energy. A colossal, localized earthquake lifted a 20-foot wide section of the desert, heaving it upward with the force of a volcanic tremor. The 70-ton Warhammer was not merely jolted, it was hoisted, its left track clawing impotently at the air as the entire vehicle listed at a sickening 45-degree angle. The sound was a deafening, grinding shriek of tortured metal and a deep subterranean roar that vibrated through our own hull, a bass note of primal fury. For a single, heart-stopping second, the thing that had done it revealed itself. As the sand cascaded off the rising mound of earth, a segment of its body broke the surface. It was a glimpse no more than 2 or 3 seconds, but it was burned into every retina. It was a cylinder of pale, segmented flesh, thicker than the tank itself, its surface slick with a dark, viscous fluid that glistened in the harsh sun. It had no discernible eyes, no mouth, only an endless, ribbed hide that flexed with impossible power before it withdrew back into the churning sand as swiftly as it had appeared. It was a worm, a leviathan of the deep earth, and its sheer scale made the mighty Abrams look like a child's toy. Then the sand collapsed back in on itself. The Warhammer slammed down onto its tracks with a ground-shaking impact that sent a fresh plume of dust into the air. The immediate, radio-silent shock was broken by a torrent of panicked, overlapping transmissions from inside the stricken vehicle. Their commander's voice was a ragged scream, describing a near-overturn, structural integrity alarms, and the fleeting, impossible sight of something no military manual had ever prepared them for. Inside our own tank, the world froze. Sergeant Cox, who had spent days ridiculing every anomaly, was utterly silent, his face a pale mask of stunned disbelief. Chief Rodriguez had his. .50 caliber traversed, sweeping the settling sand, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out in cords. Dr. Evans was frantically scribbling in his notebook, his hands trembling, capturing the scale, the movement, the brief physiology of the entity. My own breath hitched in my chest, my hands frozen on a shell I had been about to load, the cold metal suddenly feeling flimsy and insignificant. Captain Miller did not speak for a long moment. He stared at the scene ahead, at the crippled Warhammer and the now still sand, and the last vestiges of official denial crumbled from his face. The disciplined commander who had clung to protocol and commands dismissals was gone, replaced by a man staring into the abyss. His voice, when it finally came over the battalion net, was different, stripped of its usual clipped authority. It was low, grave, and carried the weight of irrevocable truth. He broke procedure, his transmission cutting through the chaos with a simple, stark declaration of an unknown hostile contact and a direct, urgent request for immediate backup and aerial support. It was more than a call for help. It was an admission. The point of no return had been crossed. The enemy was no longer a rumor, a glitch, or a set of strange tracks. It was here, it was real, and it was beneath their feet. The silence that followed, the creature's disappearance, was more terrifying than the attack itself. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from equal parts shock and the dawning realization that their world had irrevocably changed. Back within the relative safety of the forward operating base, the steel walls of the barracks and command tents no longer felt like protection, but like a flimsy cage. The creature was not out there in the desert, it was in here, in the space between each man's thoughts, a shared phantom that had cracked the unit's cohesion wide open. The first fracture appeared in the command tent. Captain Miller stood before a map, his finger tracing potential patrol routes, but his eyes were distant, haunted. Chief Rodriguez, his face a granite mask of grim certainty, stood opposite him. He did not raise his voice, but each word carried the weight of a lifetime spent cheating death. He argued for an immediate full-scale retreat, for pulling every asset back to a defensible perimeter until they knew what they were facing. He spoke of the ground being the enemy's territory, of the futility of fighting an opponent they could not see, could not target, and could not understand. His was the voice of hard-worn caution, the instinct to live to fight another day. Sergeant Cox, leaning against a support beam with his arms crossed, snorted in derision. The direct contact, the near destruction of the Warhammer, had not shattered his skepticism but had instead hardened it into a desperate, belligerent denial. He dismissed Rodriguez's caution as cowardice, his voice sharp and loud in the tense space. He insisted it was a freak seismic event, a gas explosion from a buried pipeline, anything but the living horror they had all glimpsed. To acknowledge the creature was to admit that his entire worldview, a universe governed by ballistics and enemy action, was a lie. His arguments were flares of anger, bright and hot, burning away the last remnants of unit cohesion. The narrator, Private First Class Alex, retreated into the shadowed corner of his own mind. The cold dread that had been uncoiling in his gut for days had now blossomed into a full-blown, paralyzing terror. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pale, segmented flesh, felt the phantom lurch of the tank as the earth betrayed them. His hands, which had learned the rhythm of loading shells, now trembled uncontrollably. He watched the argument between the veteran and the skeptic not as a debate over tactics, but as a terrifying confirmation that the adults, the men who were supposed to have all the answers, were just as lost and frightened as he was. His battle was internal, a silent scream against the rising tide of panic that threatened to drown him. Amidst the fracturing psychology, Dr. Evans provided a bizarre clinical counterpoint. While the soldiers argued, he sat at a small field table, his notebook open, surrounded by printouts of the sensor data from the attack. He was not afraid. He was fascinated. His pen moved in quick, sure strokes, diagramming the creature's behavior. He analyzed the angle of the sand's eruption, the speed of its withdrawal, the apparent lack of a direct predatory intent. He muttered to himself about ambush predators and territorial displays, about bioluminescence and pressurized fluid dynamics. His scientific detachment was an island of calm in the sea of human fear, but it was an alien calm, one that did nothing to soothe the raw nerves of the men around him. He was studying the storm, from behind glass, while they were being tossed in the waves. The thematic exploration of stress, leadership, and the fragility of the human mind under duress was laid bare in that sweltering tent. Captain Miller's leadership, once an unshakable pillar of protocol, now wavered under the strain of an impossible decision. Chief Rodriguez's experience had become a burden of terrifying foresight. Sergeant Cox's skepticism had curdled into a dangerous liability. The narrator's youth made him a sponge for the collective anxiety, and Dr. Evans' intellect created an unbridgeable chasm between understanding and feeling. They were no longer a crew bound by duty and camaraderie. They were a collection of isolated psyches, their fears and denials and clinical curiosities pulling them in different directions, their unity shattered by the simple, earth-shattering truth that the ground beneath their feet was alive, and it was hungry. The desert did not give them time to mend their fractured spirits. The attack came not as a single, focused strike, but as a symphony of orchestrated chaos, a brutal, multi-pronged assault that turned their world into a roaring, blinding, and bloody nightmare. It began with a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the very particles of sand, a vibration that climbed up through the tank's hull and into their teeth. Then, the world exploded. 100 meters to their left, the desert floor beneath a tank call sign Mjolnir simply disintegrated. A geyser of sand and rock shot 20 feet into the air, and from the heart of the eruption, the creature's true form surged upward. It was not just a segment this time, but a full, terrifying length of its pale, ringed body, a living pillar of muscle that blotted out the sun. It came down upon Mjolnir not with a crushing blow, but with a whip-like lash, its colossal weight and momentum striking the turret with a deafening metallic shriek of shearing steel. The tank rocked violently, its main gun bending at a grotesque angle as the creature recoiled back into the earth, leaving a gaping, smoking ruin in its wake. Simultaneously, another tank, Valkyrie, to their right, was lifted from behind, its rear deck rising into the air as the sand beneath its treads collapsed into a sinkhole, the air filled with a cacophony of desperate, screaming radio traffic. The frantic shouts of commanders swallowed by the creature's subterranean roar, a sound like a mountain tearing itself apart. Gunfire erupted, a frantic, useless staccato as coaxial machine guns, and 50 cals hosed the swirling dust clouds, the tracers vanishing into the maelstrom without effect. They were shooting at a ghost, at the earth itself. Inside their own tank, the sensory overload was absolute. Captain Miller's voice was a raw, strained command, ordering the driver to reverse to find solid ground. Chief Rodriguez was firing the .50 caliber in controlled, sweeping bursts, his face a grim mask of concentration, though he had no clear target. The compartment filled with the choking, abrasive dust that seeped through every seal, stinging their eyes and coating their tongues. The roar of the creature, the frantic gunfire, the shriek of tearing metal from other vehicles, and the blaring of their own internal collision alarms merged into a single, overwhelming wall of noise that pummeled their sanity. Then, the world beneath them lurched. A violent upward heave threw them all against their restraints. The tank tilted forward, its nose digging into the sand as something immense moved directly under their hull. They were the target now. Through his vision block, the narrator saw the sand directly in front of the glacis plate bulge upward, then split open like a rotten fruit. The creature's head, or what he assumed was its head, surfaced. It was a gaping, toothless maw of pale, pulsating flesh, large enough to swallow their tank whole. It was lined not with teeth, but with concentric rings of sharp, bony protrusions that spiraled into a dark, bottomless throat. Desperation took over. Sergeant Cox, his skepticism finally vaporized by pure terror, fired the main gun. The blast was deafening in the confined space, the shell exiting with a concussive whoosh. It struck the open maw point blank. There was no explosive impact, only a wet, sickening thump as the round was. Swallowed by the fleshy darkness, the creature recoiled, not in pain, but in what seemed like annoyance, a shudder running through its visible length before it began to submerge, dragging a torrent of sand with it into the depths. But it was not finished. As it withdrew, its massive body scraped along their left side. The sound was a nails-on-chalkboard screech magnified 1,000 times, the sound of their armor being gouged by unimaginable force. The tank was shoved sideways, its treads losing purchase. For a heart-stopping second, they balanced on the brink of a roll, the world tilting at a crazy angle, before slamming back down onto both tracks. The lights flickered, and for a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the fading subterranean rumble of the creature's departure. The brutal encounter had lasted less than a minute. When the dust began to settle, the narrator looked around the compartment. Chief Rodriguez was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Sergeant Cox was simply staring at his firing console, his hands shaking. Captain Miller's face was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the commander's override. They were alive, but the cost of that survival was etched into every strained line of their faces and into the new, deep scars that now ran the length of their steel fortress. The mystery was gone, replaced by the visceral, terrifying knowledge of the thing that lived beneath the sand, and the chilling understanding that its assault had not been an attempt to destroy them, but merely a testing of their strength. The silence that settled after the creature's retreat was thick with the taste of dust and dread. Their tank, scarred and shuddering, sat askew on the churned earth, a monument to their near destruction. The frantic radio chatter from other units had died down, replaced by a low, grim inventory of damage and casualties. They were still alive, but the shock of the direct assault had stripped away all pretense and argument. What remained was a raw, primal need for a solution, a way to fight back against the impossible. There were no more debates about retreat or denial. The creature had made the next move, and now it was their turn. Captain Miller's face, pale beneath a film of grime, was a study in forced focus. The disciplined commander reasserted himself, not with blind protocol, but with a cold military logic, forged in the furnace of their shared terror. He gathered the survivors, Chief Rodriguez, Dr. Evans, Sergeant Cox, and the narrator, Private Alex. Around a makeshift sand table they scraped together outside the damaged tank. The desert around them was a battlefield, but the enemy had vanished, leaving only scars on the land and in their minds. Miller's plan was simple, brutal, and born of necessity. They would stop reacting and start hunting. Using a stick, Miller traced a large lopsided circle in the sand. This was the kill zone. Chief Rodriguez, his eyes narrowed with a veteran's calculating gaze, immediately began overlaying the plan with tactical refinements. He pointed to the sensor logs from their own tank and the others, identifying a pattern in the creature's subterranean approach vectors. It favored certain depths, its movements creating a predictable, sinusoidal signature on the ground-penetrating radar just before it struck. Rodriguez proposed using this against it. They would bait the trap, using a lone tank as a deliberate, tempting target, while the others positioned themselves at the flanks of the predicted emergence point, their guns silent and engines off, lying in wait like predators themselves. The key, Rodriguez explained with a quiet intensity, was not to shoot the thing, but to make the ground itself their weapon. They would gather every pound of C4, every satchel charge, every high-explosive shell they could spare from the damaged vehicles. These would be buried in a concentrated pattern within the kill zone, rigged with a single remote detonator. The goal was not a direct hit on its armored flesh, but a catastrophic shockwave through the medium it called home. They would turn the sand into a bomb and let the Earth's own pressure do the work of tearing it apart. Dr. Evans, who had been listening with rapt attention, his earlier detachment replaced by a fierce, practical urgency, leaned forward. He pointed to the sketch of the creature in his notebook, to the segmented, muscular rings of its body. He suggested a weakness. The creature's locomotion, he theorized, relied on the transfer of immense hydraulic pressure through its segments. A concentrated, simultaneous concussive force directly beneath its center of mass would not just wound it, it could cause a catastrophic failure of its internal pressure system, a rupture from within. He estimated the optimal depth for the explosives and the precise timing needed based on the creature's observed speed. His science, once an object of ridicule, was now the sharpest tool in their arsenal. The unit mobilized with a grim, focused energy that bordered on frenzy. The arguments and fractured psychology of hours before were forgotten, subsumed by the sheer physical necessity of the task. Sergeant Cox, his skepticism finally and utterly purged, worked alongside the engineers, his strong arms hauling crates of explosives with a grim determination. There was no more denial in his eyes, only a cold, killing intent. Medic Jenkins moved among the men, distributing water and a quiet word, his presence a steadying reminder of what they were fighting for: simple survival. Private Alex found himself handed a spade, his job to help dig the shallow pits for the explosive charges. The physical labor was a blessing, a way to channel the trembling terror in his hands into a purposeful, rhythmic motion. As he dug into the warm sand, he felt the ghost of the creature's movement deep below, a phantom vibration that made his heart stutter, but he kept digging alongside Chief Rodriguez, who worked with a calm, relentless efficiency. The veteran would occasionally pause, placing a hand flat on the ground as if feeling for a heartbeat, his eyes distant, listening to the desert. He was no longer just a soldier following a plan, he was a hunter reading the spoor of his prey. As the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the prepared killing field, the trap was set. The lone bait tank sat in the center of the circle, its engine a low, inviting hum. The other vehicles were hidden behind dunes, their crews silent and waiting, fingers resting on triggers and the single, fateful detonator. The plan was a desperate gamble, a fusion of Miller's command logic, Rodriguez's tactical instinct, and Evans's scientific insight. It was a testament to their resourcefulness under unimaginable pressure, a coordinated counterattack born from the ashes of their fear. They had no idea if it would work. They only knew that they were finished being victims. They had lured the desert's secret into the light, and now they waited in the gathering dark, ready to answer its roar with fire. The desert, in the wake of the detonation, was a landscape of stunned silence. The thunderous roar of the explosion had vanished, leaving behind a vacuum of sound that was somehow more deafening. A fine gray dust, the pulverized remains of sand, and something else, something organic, hung in the air like a shroud, muting the harsh sun into a dull, bruised orange. The first thing that struck the narrator, Private Alex, as he pushed open the commander's hatch, was the smell. It was the familiar, acrid scent of cordite, but underneath it was something new and foul, a coppery biological stench, like a slaughterhouse buried in hot earth. The visual confirmation of the damage was a slow, dawning horror. Their own tank, scarred and battered, sat at the edge of the blast zone, but others had not been so fortunate. 2 Abrams lay as broken husks. One was half submerged. In a fresh crater, its turret wrenched from its ring, the long barrel of its main gun bent into a useless, drooping question mark. The other had been flipped onto its back, its pale underbelly exposed to the sky, the treads still slowly turning in the air like the legs of a dead insect. These were not just damaged vehicles, they were tombs. Around them, the sand was littered with the confetti of war, torn canvas, shredded equipment, and dark, glistening stains that stood out starkly against the pale gold. The rescue teams arrived in a storm of rotor wash and grinding tires, their arrival breaking the unnatural stillness. Medics in dusty uniforms moved with a grim, practiced efficiency through the carnage, their faces set in masks of professional detachment that could not fully hide their shock. They moved from one still form to another, performing the quick, hopeless triage of the battlefield. Some soldiers were simply gone, vaporized in the initial blast or swallowed by the collapsing earth. Others were pulled from wrecked hulls, their bodies broken and limp, their uniforms dark with blood. The less severely injured sat in dazed clusters, their eyes vacant, while Medic Jenkins moved among them, his hands swift and sure, applying pressure to wounds, starting 4S, his calm a tiny island of order in the sea of chaos. Private Alex's gaze fell on a single dust-caked combat boot, lying alone near the edge of the crater. It was perfectly laced. His mind, numb with shock, tried to assemble a person around it, a face, a name, a laugh shared over a card game. But the person was gone, erased, leaving only this mundane, heartbreaking artifact. This was the cost, not abstract, not a number on a report, but a boot with no one to fill it. The grief was a physical weight in his chest, a cold stone of loss for men who, hours before, had been breathing, joking, fearing. They had survived, but survival felt less like a victory and more like a theft. They had bought their lives with the currency of others, and the debt felt crushing. He looked over at his own crew. Chief Rodriguez stood apart, his broad shoulders slumped, staring at the crater where the creature had died. There was no triumph in his posture, only a profound, weary sadness. Sergeant Cox sat on an ammunition crate, head in his hands, his earlier belligerence utterly extinguished, replaced by the hollowed-out look of a man who has seen his certainties annihilated. Captain Miller was speaking in low, strained tones with the rescue commander, his gestures sharp, his face a landscape of stress and responsibility. Dr. Evans was on his knees at the crater's edge, not with his notebook, but simply staring into the churned, foul-smelling earth, the thrill of discovery utterly gone, replaced by the grim reality of what his theories had helped unleash. The surreal nature of the event settled over Alex like a fever dream. It was all there, the military vehicles, the medics, the procedures of recovery, the familiar architecture of a wartime aftermath. But it was all built upon the impossible, the corpse of a thing that should not exist lying just out of sight beneath the sand. The juxtaposition was dizzying. They were soldiers grappling with the aftermath of a battle against a myth. The thematic elements of grief and the cost of survival were not abstract concepts here. They were the very air they breathed, the dust in their lungs. They had faced the unknown and, through violence and sacrifice, had beaten it back into the earth. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the devastation in shades of blood and fire, the victory felt Pyrrhic. They had learned the price of looking into the abyss, and the bill had been paid in broken steel, lost friends, and the permanent scarring of their own souls. The creature was dead, but its shadow would stretch long into the coming nights, a darkness they had all swallowed, and which they would now carry within them forever. The truth was the first casualty, and its burial was a swift, clinical, and meticulously orchestrated affair. The arrival of the men from higher command was not like the chaotic, desperate influx of the rescue teams. They came in unmarked vehicles, their uniforms crisp despite the dust, their faces closed and impenetrable. They moved through the aftermath with the detached efficiency of auditors, their eyes cataloging the devastation not as a tragedy, but as a problem to be solved, a narrative to be controlled. The creature's corpse, or what remained of it, was their primary concern. Under the glare of portable floodlights, a specialized team in hazardous materials suits descended into the crater, their movements hidden behind opaque screens they erected with military precision. By dawn, the foul-smelling, churned earth had been excavated, the organic evidence loaded into sealed containers and driven away, leaving behind only a larger, emptier hole, a metaphor for the void they were carving out of history. The official briefing was held in the command tent, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and suppressed anger. The officer who addressed them was a full-bird colonel, a man whose aura of authority was so dense it seemed to push the very walls outward. He did not ask for their account of the event. He presented them with his. In calm, unambiguous terms, he laid out the new reality. The incident was now officially classified as a sophisticated insurgent attack. The enemy, he explained, had utilized a network of deep-bore tunnels to plant a massive buried IED, which they had detonated with tragic success. The perceived movements and unidentified contacts were attributed to advanced enemy deception tactics designed to sow confusion and panic. The story was a seamless, bulletproof fabrication, a cage of plausible lies built around the incredible truth. Captain Miller stood at attention before the colonel, his posture ramrod straight, but a faint tremor was visible in the hand he held clenched behind his back. He listened, his jaw working silently, and when ordered to disseminate the new narrative to his men and ensure their compliance, he gave a single sharp nod. His yes, sir, was crisp and correct, but it lacked its usual conviction. It was the sound of a man driving a knife into his own integrity, a reluctant complicity born from a lifetime of conditioning to follow orders, even when they tasted of ash. Chief Rodriguez, leaning against the tent pole at the back of the room, did not bother to hide his cynicism. A low, derisive snort escaped him, a puff of air that was louder than a shout in the tense silence. When the colonel's icy gaze fell upon him, Gunny met it without flinching, his own eyes flat and knowing. He didn't argue, he simply let his silence and his expression speak volumes. His was the weary contempt of a man who had seen too many truths buried for the sake of political convenience, who understood that the real enemy was often not the one in the crosshairs, but the one writing the after-action reports. One by one they were called forward. They were not asked to sign a document. They were made to give their verbal, sworn oath of secrecy. It was a ritual of silencing, a verbal gag order administered under the unblinking gaze of the colonel and his aides. The consequences for deviation were spelled out in cold, legalistic terms: court-martial, dishonorable discharge, imprisonment. The weight of the promise settled on each man's shoulders like a lead mantle. Sergeant Cox, for once, had no sarcastic retort. He gave his oath in a hollow monotone, his newfound belief in the creature now becoming a state secret. Medic Jenkins swore his oath with the solemnity of a doctor taking the Hippocratic Oath, his promise to do no harm perverted into a vow of silence. For the narrator, Private Alex, the moment was surreal. He repeated the words he was told to say, his voice sounding thin and foreign in his own ears. But as he spoke the official lie, he felt the real truth, the weight of the buried thing, settle deep inside him. It was a physical sensation, a cold, dense stone of knowledge lodged in his gut. He looked at the faces of his crewmates, Miller's strained compliance, Rodriguez's simmering resentment, Cox's hollowed-out shock, and saw that they all carried their own versions of the same stone. The evidence had been suppressed, the story rewritten, but the memory of the pale, segmented flesh, the roar from the deep, and the stench of its death were indelible. They had survived the creature's attack, but this cover-up was a different kind of assault, one that left no visible scars but infected the soul. The truth was not gone, it was just interred, and he knew with a chilling certainty that he would now spend the rest of his life feeling the weight of it, a ghost in the earth and a ghost in his mind, forever straining to be heard. Weeks later, the desert had not forgiven them, nor had it forgotten. The official story held, a brittle shell of sanctioned lies that everyone pretended to believe. The narrator, Private Alex, was back at the forward operating base, performing the same rituals of morning drills and equipment maintenance. But the motions were hollow, the camaraderie strained. The men moved through their duties like ghosts, their eyes occasionally meeting in silent, shared acknowledgement of the thing that could not be named. Rumors, soft as scorpion whispers, slithered through the ranks, talk of fresh, spiraled tracks found and quickly erased by command, of night watches cut short by a deep subsonic hum that vibrated in the fillings of a soldier's teeth. The perceived safety of the base was a fragile illusion, a sheet of ice over dark water. One evening, Alex found himself alone on the observation post, the skeletal frame of the guard tower a familiar perch under a sky bleeding from orange to deep violet. The desert stretched out, vast and seemingly placid. The dunes cast in long, purple shadows. It was in this quiet moment, as the last of the day's heat bled from the air, that he saw it. His gaze, idly tracing the familiar horizon, snagged on a distant dune, one he had memorized the shape of over countless watches. It shifted, not with the gentle, wind-blown drift of settling sand, but with a sudden, localized heave, as if a great shoulder had shrugged just beneath the surface. A portion of its crest slumped inward, collapsing in a silent, graceful avalanche that defied the still evening air. It was a movement that was utterly, unnaturally wrong. No alarm sounded, no radio chatter erupted. The world remained still, the official narrative undisturbed. But Alex felt the stone of buried truth turn over in his gut, cold and heavy. The creature was not gone. It had not been a single, monstrous anomaly to be excavated and forgotten. It was a part of this place, as eternal as the sand and the sun. Their battle, their sacrifice, their carefully constructed cover-up. It had all been a temporary disturbance, a flicker of violence on the skin of a deep and ancient world that had simply waited for them to leave. He did not report what he saw. The words would have died in his throat, another unspeakable truth to be suppressed. He simply stood there, his hands gripping the rough wood of the railing as the stars began to prick the darkening sky. The dread that had haunted him since the first impact did not sharpen into a new panic. Instead, it settled into a permanent, low hum in his blood, a chilling certainty. The unknown had not been defeated. It had merely retreated, biding its time in the deep, dark places of the earth, a constant, patient reminder of how fragile their perceived safety truly was, and how vast and hungry the silence beneath their feet could be.